So hi, today I want to talk to you about Fig Monday. This is the day that directly follows Palm Sunday, and yes, that's its real name. And it's rooted in a story that we find in Mark chapter 11 verses 12 through to 20. Now in 12 through to 20 we find these two components of the story, and they feel almost disparate, like they shouldn't be together. The first is Jesus cursing the fig tree, and the second is Jesus cleansing the temple. And although these stories feel like they shouldn't actually be connected in any way, there's this very strong bond between them, and I want to explore that today as the heart of our devotional. So let's begin with the fig tree. It's breakfast time on the Monday. Jesus is walking into Jerusalem, and he sees this fig tree at the side of the road, but there's no fruit on it, so he curses it. Well, that's a really weird thing, because actually figs aren't meant to produce their crop until the late summer and early autumn. So why has he completely lost his temper on this tree and cursed it for producing something it shouldn't be producing at that time of year? Maybe it's because he was feeling hangry, but actually, after the 40 days in the wilderness praying and fasting, I think he could cope with his own hunger. Now, there's something much more powerful actually going on, and that's because there is a whole load of potent imagery wrapped up in the fig tree relating to Israel. So in Deuteronomy chapter 8, where Moses is laying out the various kind of crops that are going to harvest in the land of Canaan when the Israelites move in, listed amongst the grape and the grain and the olives is the fig tree. Secondly, in 1 Kings 4:25, the chronicler is trying to tell us about a period of time in the nation's history where there was just prolonged peace. And he describes it like this. He says, from Dan in the north to Beersheba in the south, every man lived in safety and sat under the shade of his own fig tree. Now that's very profound, because a fig tree takes a long time to grow. And so if you're able to sit in the shade of your fig tree, it means there's been this super extended and prolonged period of the shalom of God just saturating your entire life. We then get Hosea chapter 9 verse 10 describing some of the ancestors of the nation of Israel as the early fruit of the fig tree. This sense of they are the first fruits of the fuller harvest that is to come. If we flip to the New Testament, John chapter 1, Jesus meets somebody who's going to become a disciple, a guy called Nathanael. And he has a word of knowledge about him. And he says, before we met, I saw you sitting under the fig tree, and you are a true Israelite in which there is no deceit. So when Jesus turns up outside of Jerusalem and basically pronounces judgment or a curse upon this fig tree, it's like kind of radical guerrilla street preaching. Everybody thought, wow, this is like the days of the prophets. And what's going on? Jesus is actually using the very imagery for Israel, for the nation of God, and saying it is fruitless. Well, then we move on to the second part of the story, and we find this as we read through, where Jesus walks into the temple and he sees all the trading that's going on, and he completely loses the plot. Well, the backstory to this is as follows. Josephus, the Jewish historian, tells us that the priesthood at the time of Jesus was actually quite corrupt. We think about people like Annas and Caiaphas. And there were 3 feasts every year that people had to attend, and they had to bring sacrifices, and those sacrifices had to be spotless and without blemish. And so what happens is they would turn up, but these priests are the checkpoint for these sacrifices, and they would say, oh no, sorry, that's not good enough to sacrifice. But we happen to have here some lovely pre-approved samples, and you can buy one instead at a highly inflated price. In fact, we know from the Mishnah that at the time of Jesus, the fields from Bethlehem right into Jerusalem were given over for the breeding of the flocks and herds that were necessary to supply the sacrificial system. That's kind of ironic in a way, because if you think about the shepherds visiting Jesus on the night he was born in Bethlehem, they weren't so much coming to visit a baby, they were actually coming to examine a sacrifice. And so people like Annas and Caiaphas, they were on this. They realised the money-making potential. And in fact, these stalls and booths that were selling were known as the booths of Annas. And they were raking it in. They were raking it in from highly inflated prices for sacrifices. They were raking it in because all of the business that took place in the temple had to be conducted with Jewish coinage. And so, of course, when you're exchanging money, there's exchange rates, and they hiked these through the roof as well. Archaeologists tell us that as they've excavated the area of the city where they knew many of the priests lived, they found houses with mosaic floors and frescoes on the wall and steam rooms and wine racks with bottles of wine that are worth, in today's money, I guess, £3,000 or more a bottle. And so Jesus walks in and he sees all of this and he loses it. He makes this cord whip and he starts driving out the sellers and the money changers, and tables go over. Animals are running everywhere. It's probably one of the most powerful moments of his ministry outside of the cross, where you see the heart of God. But the truth is, for both of those stories, the cursing of the fig tree and the cleansing of the temple, they're both rooted in something that happened the day before. Jesus is riding down the Mount of Olives. People are singing, Hosanna, save us now. And they're waving the palm branch. And it's at that point that he starts weeping and saying, oh, Jerusalem, if you only you had known what would bring you peace this day. So what's going on? Well, they were deluded. They were deluded about where peace was coming from, and they were deluded about the nature of that peace. And it's all rooted in a story in the intertestamental period. You'll know that Israel had had many adversaries and foes. We had people like the Assyrians destroyed Israel. The Babylonians took Judah captive. The Greeks came in and then exerted control. And there was a king called Antiochus Epiphanes IV who took over Jerusalem. He was a Greek, and he made ownership of the Torah a capital offence. If your baby boys were circumcised, they were thrown from the city walls. He marched into the temple and set up a statue of Zeus in the holy place. And then to top it all, he sacrificed a pig and draped its entrails all over the holy altar of the temple. Well, the Jews at that time kicked off, and there was this huge rebellion led by a family called the Maccabees. And eventually they kicked the Greeks out. And they suddenly had their freedom for the first time in centuries. But the reality is their temple was now desecrated. And so late in that year, right in the late autumn, almost winter, they had the Feast of Dedication. They rededicated the temple. But that year they hadn't been able to celebrate Tabernacles, which is held in the autumn. And so the rededication of the temple and Tabernacles was held together. And so they're doing what they do at the Feast of Tabernacles. They're crying out, Hosanna, God save us now. And they were rustling these palm leaves, which was symbolic of the autumn rains that would come and set them up for their harvests the following year. That one moment at the rededication of the temple, the meaning and the freighting of that activity changed. Before, in the Old Testament, it had been about God save us by providing the food we need for next year and the rains we need to give us the food. But from the dedication of the temple onwards, that Hosanna and the waving of the palm branch actually took on a nationalistic freighting. It became almost like a political thing. And so on the Mount of Olives that day, as Jesus is riding down and they're saying, God save us, and they're rustling the palm leaves, he goes, you don't get it. You don't get it. You think Messiah is coming as a political leader to kick out the Romans. That's not what's going to give you peace. And so he weeps over Jerusalem. The thing was, they were expecting him to turn right, march into the Antonia fortress and drive the Romans out. But he actually turned left. He walked into the temple and he cleansed it. They wanted to be free from external oppression, and he wanted to bring freedom to the heart of their faith. They wanted him to do something for them. He wanted to do something in them. And so the next day, after the cursing of the fig tree, as they walk past the tree again, we see that it is now withered. And the way that Mark positions that story, fig tree, cleansing of temple, fig tree, it's like the bookends around the story. This fig tree is not just symbolic of the nation, the people of God, God's family. It's symbolic of its religious system. It bears no fruit. It bears no fruit. There is no fruit in it. And that's why he cleans out its heart. Now in Genesis 3:7 we get one other really interesting message about the fig leaf, the fig tree. Adam and Eve have sinned, their relationship with God is fractured, they feel out of sorts, and so they try and cover their nakedness by sewing fig leaves together. It's the first recorded religious act in the Bible. Man and woman, under their own steam, try and make themselves right with God. And I think this is what's wrapped up and the heart of this story that actually Mark is telling us. You see, the fig leaf, the symbol of that religious system in Israel, needed the needle to make it work. It was something you did. And they had an option to go for the needle, or Jesus, as he walks into town in that very last week of his life, says you can take the nail. You can have righteousness on your terms. You can try and sew something together that's going to make you feel good before God, but actually won't make you right with God. Or you can accept my way, which is the nail, where I, the spotless, sinless one, will die as a sacrifice for you so you can have true freedom. And I think that's the challenge for all of us. Are we going to take the needle? Or are we going to take the nail? You know, Jesus said in this world there will always be trouble. There will always be another oppressor or another thing bringing pressure from the outside. And it might be the Assyrians, it might be the Babylonians, it might be the Greeks, it might be the Romans, it might be the financial crash, it might be coronavirus. But the reality is this. We have to be really careful that we don't spend our time telling God to do something for us, that we actually miss the very thing he wants to do in us. And that's what I want to give you as a takeaway today. I want you to spend some time with Father and just say, Father, you're the great fruit inspector, you're the great gardener. Is my life fruitful? And if it's not, show me where I've picked up the needle and help me to choose the nail. And the truth is, when we reject the needle and we accept the nail, he comes to dwell in us, and we truly can be free as a bird, because the freedom bird, the Holy Spirit, will come and take up residence in us. So I just pray that this little study blesses you and challenges you, and I'll see you later in the week. Goodbye.